What's up guys, Asian here again with another theory crafting video. You can also call this a build video, I suppose. Today we're going to be exploring the Rezplar, specifically whether or not it is a good build, whether it can pull good DPS, and what the difference is between Kagrenacs and Julianos if you are going to be running a Rezplar. Now for those of you guys who don't know, a Rezplar is basically a Templar that is running Kagrenac's Hope. So if we take a look at Kagrenac's Hope right here, the 2 through 4 is max magicka, magicka regen, and max health. The 5-piece adds 222 spell damage when everything is golded out. But the second effect is what kind of makes Kags very powerful. It decreases the time it takes to resurrect an ally by 25%, and you restore some magicka when you resurrect an ally. Now when you combine this with the Templar's Restoring Light passive, Master Ritualist, which increases your resurrection speed by 20%, that ends up being about a 50% cut in your resurrection time. So the normal res time, or time it takes to res somebody, is going to be 7 seconds. So with Kagrenac's Hopes, as well as Master Ritualist, you actually cut that amount of time down to about 3.5 seconds. So you're basically more or less cutting your res time in half with Kagrenac's Hope and Master Ritualist on a Templar. So that's kind of where the term Rezplar comes from, just because you're resing basically twice as fast as everybody else can. That is a playstyle that some people pick in raids, particularly in progression guilds. It's not uncommon to see a DPS play as a Rezplar, Templar with Kagrenac's Hope, just so if people are going down, they have a designated reser, so that can just go out, res somebody in 3 seconds, and then they can jump back into the fight, so it's overall a minimal loss in DPS. But the question is, of course, if you are bringing along a Rezplar, how much DPS are you actually losing when you compare it to something like Julianos? Take a look at Julianos here. We're losing out 1666 spell crit as well as 77 spell damage. Maintain our magicka, we get some magicka regen and we gain some health, but we are losing some spell damage and a relatively large chunk of spell crit here. 1666 spell crit works out to be about 7.6% crit chance. So you can see right here we're sitting at 41.9% crit chance with Kagrenac's Hope. If we swap over to our Julie set, we see it goes up to 49.6, so it is a fairly large crit chance drop. So the question is, how much DPS are you losing by using Kagrenac's Hope? Because it's not necessarily so clear-cut because of that extra magicka regen. Templars generally have a worse time sustaining. They're kind of middle of the road in terms of magicka DPS. They're better than Magsorks, but not quite as good as magicka Nightblades. So the question is, does that extra regen kind of make up for that loss of spell damage because you're able to maintain a rotation for a longer period of time before you need to heavy attack? So that's kind of where things kind of come a little bit more muddled, and hopefully that's something we can answer today. I am not going to lie to you, I don't believe Kagrenac's Hope is capable of pulling the same level of DPS as Julianos. It's just not mathematically in Kagrenac's Hope's favor. However, I do believe that using Kagrenac's Hope instead of Julianos, the difference is not going to be substantial. It's not going to be a huge gap, basically. And using a Rezplar is definitely very useful for progression guilds, for things like, a hard modes, for Asylum Sanctorium. It's also very, very useful. I know several progression guilds are using at least one Rezplar when they are trying to progress through the various Asylum fights. So it is a playstyle that is very viable in the end game. It's just a question of how much DPS can you actually pull when you're using Kag. So that's kind of what we're going to answer today. So the only thing we're going to be swapping out today is going to be the Kagrenac's Hope. We're going to replace that with Julianos. We're in 2 Parses, one with Julie, one with Kags. The other thing that we're going to be kind of playing around with is the health enchant. Since Kags gives us max health as the 4-piece bonus, you're able to basically take a health enchant off of one of your large pieces and use a magicka enchant, or you can keep using that health enchant and just have some extra health buffering there. So we are using Witch Mother, so you can see here we are trading off getting a little bit extra health compared to using Julie. We're getting about 300 or so extra health. We are losing some magicka in the process. We lose about 300 magicka, so it's an even trade-off between magicka and health. But that is something else that we're going to be switching up. So when we swap back to Julie, we'll be replacing the magicka enchant here with a health enchant, because that's kind of what we're going to be doing in a raid. So we want to keep everything as close to possible as we can to a real raid scenario. I already do have Parses in place, so we will be able to get an average, take a look at the spread, and we will compare our combat metric Parses as well to kind of see how things play out. So this is the Kag's parse right here. So one of the things I am going to do is I'm going to show you guys kind of the difference in sustain that you can anticipate with that extra regen bonus. So keep a close eye on the magicka levels before I have to go into my heavy attack. It's going to be right around here. You can see here we're about 28 or so magicka, 28% magicka. By the time I have to do my first heavy attack. Now I'm going to do the exact same rotation using the Julie build, and we'll see just how big of a difference that's going to make. Alright, so that is our Kag's parse. Now we're going to go ahead and swap out our enchants and our gear. So now we're going to be using Julianos. 5-piece Julianos here. Everything else is going to remain exactly the same. Going to recharge my weapons. You can see here we did end up losing about 300 health, but we ended up gaining back about 300 magicka. Actually, I think I actually lied a little bit there. We actually do end up with lower magicka using Julie with that health glyph compared to using Kag's Hope. So we have 36.5. Once I get my ultimate up, I'll swap back to Kag's. And put on a magicka enchant, kind of grab it from that bank. So at 36.5 with Julie and that health enchant. I'm on to this. If we go ahead and swap our magicka enchant, swap over to Kag's. See here we're at 37.7 with 300 extra health, so we do end up with more magicka with Kag's and that magicka enchant compared to Julie with the health enchant, but I'm going to swap over to Julie real quick so you guys can see why we're adding in that health enchant. With Witch Mothers we're only sitting at 15k health, and that's pretty low. I would be very uncomfortable running with that low health in vet trials, so that's why we have that health enchant there. So again, this is the Julie parse. So I'm going to do the exact same rotation as before, and you guys are going to see just how big of a difference that extra regen is going to make on our sustain. So remember, before we ended up at around 28% max magicka left. You can already see here we're already dipping well below where we were before. We actually hit about 15% of our magicka pool there. Same exact rotation, same exact order of skills between heavy attacks, but we had almost twice as much magicka with Kags compared to using Julie. So that's kind of the benefit of the Kags, that extra regen. So that is our Julianos parse. We're going to take a look at our combat metrics. So our Julie parse pulled about 33.7k. I'm just going to add this value into our spreadsheet. And our Kags Hope pulled about the same, just slightly lower, but it's still around 33.7k. So we can take a look here at our regen per second versus our drain per second. With our Kags, we have about a 200 disparity, and without it, we're sitting at about 300. So it is a that extra regen per second does actually help out a fair amount there. But beyond that, we can see that I'd imagine that most of our DPS here is going to end up being lower overall. Of course, there is kind of some RNG involved with the crit chance. Got 39 crit here, got 43 crit here, so we did end up getting lower crit chances overall compared to our actual crit on this parse. That might explain some of that disparity there. When we look over our averages, you'll kind of see what I mean. You can see here light attacks average DPS was 3457, 3475, with about the same amount of weaves here, 43 compared to 40. Let's see here, block aid 3472 compared to 3201. Thunderous Rage here is 3684, 3147. So you can see there is kind of a back and forth, and that's just kind of the nature of parsing. So now if we go ahead and take a look at our spreadsheet, we have 7 parses across both categories, so 14 parses in total. Here are the averages, and here's the standard deviations. So you can see here that Julianos is still pulling ahead of Kags on average by about 1k, which ends up being about a 3.3% difference in DPS, but Kags is still pulling a decent DPS. You can see here that 33k is not a low number at all. It is enough to get by most vet trials and most DPS treks in those vet trials. You're probably not going to be able to do necessarily do things like vMaw hard mode with a Rezplar. You're definitely going to end up getting carried a little bit, just because your DPS potential for Magicka in general is lower compared to the other magicka DPS, with the sole exception being magicka wardens. So while your DPS is going to be lower, it is not terrible, and you can still definitely pull very good numbers in endgame content running a Rezplar, and that extra utility that you get, that insane res speed, that is going to be very helpful if you're progressing through content like hard mode trials or VAS or Maw or Hoff. Just that extra res speed will really help keep your group DPS high, just because people are going to be dead for a lesser amount of time. If your healers or tanks go down, you're not waiting 7 seconds. Instead, it's only like a 3.5 seconds. So you don't necessarily have to worry about the boss running away and potentially wiping the group with the Rezplar. So it is a playstyle that is very viable in the end game, but it is something that you should probably talk with your raid lead about, just to figure out if you can actually bring a Rezplar, if they think that the extra res speed is gonna make or break, or maybe not make or break, but be very useful for your progression run. Obviously, if you're at the stage where you're running VAA with only 2 or 3 deaths, obviously a Rezplar isn't going to be very useful for you. But if you're progressing through VAA hard mode, for example, and your group is wiping continuously, maybe bringing a Rezplar wouldn't be a bad idea. So that's it for this video. Hope you found it informative, and I'll see you guys in the next dungeon.